Winter did not arrive suddenly. It arrived as a deadline. Everything a household would eat until spring had to already be inside the house. Get the arithmetic wrong in October, and you found out in February. The harvest was not a celebration. It was a countdown, and everyone knew it. Grain was cut, bound, and carted fast, because rain on a stacked crop meant rot. Then it had to be threshed by hand, a flail, a barn floor, and weeks of work. Then winnowed to separate grain from chaff. What was left was not all his. A tenth went to the church as tithe, more went to the Lord who owned the land. Some had to be kept back as seed. Eat the seed corn, and you eat next year. What remained was the winter. Storage was the whole problem. Grain went into a store raised off the ground. Those stones were not decoration. They stopped rats climbing into the crop. Damp was the other enemy, and worse. Wet grain heats, then molds, then poisons. Meat could not be kept fresh at all, so it was salted, packed, and sealed. Salt drew the water out of the flesh. Without water, rot had nothing to work with. But salt was expensive and often scarce. So smoke did the same job, cheaper, hung high in the roof above the fire. Most livestock did not see the spring, not from cruelty, from arithmetic. Feeding an animal through winter cost fodder that the household could not spare. So in November, the killing began. Only breeding stock was kept alive. Everything else became salt meat and fat. Nothing at all was wasted. Fat was fuel, medicine, and light. Then the cold itself. Warmth meant one open fire on the floor. There was no chimney in most houses. Smoke rose, filled the roof, and stayed. It left slowly through the thatch above. It stung the eyes and blackened the lungs. It also kept the roof dry and pest-free. A wet thatch rots. A smoked one does not. Everyone slept in the same room. Heat was a shared resource, not a private one. Animals were often brought inside too. A cow gives off real warmth overnight. The floor sloped, so the mess drained away. It smelled appalling. It also worked. The fire was never allowed to die. At night, it was banked under ash. Ash starved it of air without killing it. By morning, a breath brought it back. Relighting from nothing took real work. Easier to borrow fire from a neighbor. Then there was the dark. In December, daylight lasted 8 hours. Real candles were made of beeswax. Beeswax was expensive. Almost nobody used it. Peasants used rushlights instead. A rush stalk, peeled, soaked in mutton fat. It burned for about 20 minutes. Then somebody had to light another. Winter did not mean rest. It meant different work, done indoors. Tools were repaired, rope was twisted.
Thatch was patched before the next storm. Wool was spun, every evening, by everyone. Hedges were laid while the sap was down. Ditches were dug out before the thaw. Idleness in winter cost you in spring. Daily food was mostly one thing, pottage. A pot kept permanently on the fire. Grain, peas, beans, and whatever was left. Rarely emptied, just added to endlessly. Bread was coarse, dark, and heavy. Wheat bread was for people who owned land. Ale was safer than water, and it fed you. Weak, thick, and brewed at home constantly. Then February arrived. The store was thin. The light was still short. Historians call it the hunger gap. Stores were running out. Nothing was growing. Rations were cut, quietly, week by week. The pot got thinner. The bread got darker. Bark, acorns, and old fodder went in. This is when the weak died. Not dramatically, quietly, of ordinary illness. And then, slowly, it turned. The days lengthened before the food arrived. That gap was the most dangerous part. Plowing began while stores were lowest. The hardest work and the least food. First greens came before first grain. Nettles, cress, anything edible and green. Not a feast, just the end of the worst. Staying warm outdoors came down to wool and layers of it. Wool keeps some warmth even when it is soaking wet. Linen was worn underneath, because wool against skin itches badly. Clothes were patched for years and handed down until they fell apart. A cloak was often the single most valuable thing a family owned. It was listed in wills and argued over after a death. Feet were the real problem, and they stayed the real problem. Most people had one pair of shoes, if they had any. Thin leather soles soaked through within minutes in wet snow. Wet feet in winter meant chilblains, sores, and sometimes worse. Straw was stuffed into shoes and clogs for insulation. Fire needed fuel, and fuel had to be gathered before the snow. Peasants could not simply fell whatever tree they wanted. The woods belonged to the Lord, and he counted as timber. What they held was a right to gather fallen deadwood, by hook or by crook, meaning with these two tools. Anything you could pull down without cutting was fair to take. Taking more than that was theft, and it was punished. Where there were no woods, people burned dry dung instead. Water was a daily problem that got worse when it froze. A frozen well or stream meant breaking ice before every trip. Melting snow for water took fuel that could not be spared. Snow gives far less water than it looks like it should, so the well got broken open again every single morning. Vegetables were stored in the ground rather than in the house. A clamp is a heap of roots covered in straw and soil.
The earth insulated them and kept them just above freezing. Open it in the wrong weather and the whole clamp froze solid, so it was opened rarely and only a little at a time. Milk stopped in winter because the cows stopped giving it, so autumn milk was turned into cheese that would keep. Hard cheese lasted months. Soft cheese did not last weeks.
Butter was salted heavily and packed into sealed crocks. Both were traded as much as they were eaten at home. Winter did not pause what was owed to the manor. Labor service continued, whatever the weather happened to be doing. Days were owed for plowing, carting, hedging, and repair. Failing to appear meant a fine in the manor court. The court met through winter, and it kept careful written records. Those records are why we know any of this at all. There was one bright stretch in the middle of all of it. The 12 days after Christmas were genuine holiday. No labor service was owed, and the Lord provided food. It was the one time of year most people ate meat properly. This was not generosity. It was an obligation that ran both ways. The Lord fed the village, and the village kept working for him. Then Plow Monday came, and everyone went straight back out. Winter was also when people simply got ill and stayed ill. Cold, smoke, poor food, and crowded rooms together did the damage. Chest illness spread easily in a single unventilated room. There was no real medicine, only rest and whatever was to hand. Most recovered. A predictable share of them did not. Children worked through winter alongside everybody else, scaring birds, fetching water, minding animals, gathering fuel. Winter was the most dangerous season for the very young. Cold rooms, thin food, and illness fell hardest on them. Grain was useless until it was ground, and grinding was controlled. The Lord owned the mill, and everyone was required to use it. The miller kept a share of everything he ground, by right. Millers were suspected of taking more than their share constantly. Grinding at home with a hand cord was often simply forbidden. Confiscated hand mills were sometimes set into the manor floor as paving. It was a punishment and a permanent reminder walked on daily. The church forbade meat on a great many days each year. Fridays, Wednesdays, Saturdays, all of Lent, and most feast eves. That is roughly a third of the year without any meat, so salted and dried fish became a winter staple for everyone. Dried cod kept for months and had to be soaked for days. Inland villages eat salted herring carted in barrels from the coast. Anyone with a pond kept carp in it, deliberately. For this, pigs were the one animal that fed itself if you had woodland.
In autumn, they were driven into the woods to eat fallen acorns. The right to do this was called pannage, and it was paid for. A few weeks of acorns put real fat on an animal cheaply. That fat became the household's lard, its lamps, and its cooking. A pig was the most efficient thing a poor household could own. Storms did the damage that cold alone never quite managed. A gale could strip thatch off a roof in a single night. Rain then got into the roof, and the roof began to rot. Repairs had to happen immediately, in whatever weather was doing it. Flooding was worse, because it reached the stored food. A flooded store meant the winter plan failed in one afternoon. Roads stopped working entirely for weeks at a time. Mud in autumn, then ice, then mud again in the thaw. Carts could not move, so nothing came in and nothing left. A village in winter was largely on its own resources. Whatever you had in November was what you had in March. That is the whole reason autumn mattered so enormously. Surviving winter was not clever. There was no trick to it and no secret. It was arithmetic, done carefully in autumn and then endured for 5 months. Most years, it worked. In the years it did not, the parish register got longer.